Hello, this is Charlotte Taylor doing a reading of the Polish question at the International Congress in London on the social democracy and the national struggles in Turkey. Now, the reason I am doing a joint reading of both of these texts is because I feel they cannot be separated as they take her view at the time in 1896 towards the question of national liberation and shows how she is not universally applying one view of national liberation to one state as one to another. She takes different conclusions in the Polish question and the national struggles in Turkey because she views the material conditions lead to different arguments of strategy for the causes in which social democracy wishes to promote in both of these countries, which is social progress and liberation. As we will see in the Polish question, she sees the argument of Polish independence to be one which is what's the best way of putting it? A question that is not particularly one of concern, that the independence of Poland is not a method for achieving the liberation of the proletariat or social progress. However, in Turkey, she takes the different position that the liberation of Armenia will benefit the broader communist movement. I will begin now the Polish question at the International Congress in London. 32 years ago, when what was later to become the International met for the first time in London, it opened its proceedings with a protest against the subjugation of Poland, which just then engaged for the third time in a fruitless struggle for independence. In the weeks, the International Workers' Congress met also in London and will be presented with a resolution in support of Polish independence. The similarity of the circumstances quite naturally suggests a comparison of these two events in the life of the international proletariat. The proletariat has come a long way in its development in these past 32 years. Progress is evident in every regard, while the many aspects of working class struggle look quite different from the way they looked 32 years ago, but the essential element in the entire development lies in the following. From a select ideologue, socialists have grown into a major unified party capable of handling its own affairs. Then, they barely existed in isolated groups outside the mainstream political life. In every country today, they represent the dominant factor in life of society. Footnote. Was this really the conditions back then? What days those must have been. Well, if we fight, our socialists can once again be the dominant political party in all capitalist countries. Well, not dominant, but a force to be reckoned with in all capitalist countries, but that is most currently not the case in our current events, but that is why we continue learning and why we continue fighting to make changes and make a world we want to see. This particularly is true in the major civilized countries, but in every country they are an element to be taken seriously and reckoned with at every step by the government and its ruling class alike. Then there was the question of merely spreading a new message. Today, the paramount question is the struggle of the vast popular masses, now thoroughly imbued with the gospel of socialism, can be led towards its goal. The International Congress has undergone corresponding changes in the beginning. The International was more of a council that met to formulate its basic principles in the new movement. Today it is primarily, even exclusively, a body for practical deliberations in the conscious proletariat on the urgent questions of its day-to-day struggle. All tasks and objectives are here subjugated to rigorous evaluations of their practicality. Those, however, appear to exceed the forces of the proletariat are laid aside, regardless of how attractive or appealing they may sound. This is the essential difference between the conference this year in St. Martin's Hall and the one that took place 32 years ago, and from its perspective, the resolution laid before the Congress must be examined. The resolution on the restoration of Poland presented in the National Congress reads as follows. There's a footnote here. The text of the resolution is produced here in a form presented by Rosa Luxemburg on her essay of Der Sozialpatriotism in Polen in Neuzeit CF Collected Works 1,139 FF. Alright, and the footnote. Whereas the subjugation of one nation by another can only serve the interests of the capitalists and the despots, while working for the people in both oppressed and oppressor nation is equally pernicious, whether it in the Russian Tsardom, which its own interests, internal strength, and its external significance to the subjugation and partition of Poland constitutes a permanent threat to the development of the international workers' movement. The Congress hereby resolves that the independence of Poland represents an imperative political demand both for the Polish proletariat and the international labor movement as a whole. The demand for the political independence of Poland is supported by two arguments. First, the general perniciousness of annexation from the point of view and interest of the proletariat. Second, the special significance of the subjugation of Poland for the continued existence of Russian Tsardom, and thus implication the significance of Polish independence for its downfall. Let's take the second point first. The Russian Tsardom derives neither its inner strength nor its external significance from the subjugation of Poland. This assertion in its resolution is false from A to Z. The Russian Tsardom derives its inner strength from the social revelations within Russia itself. The historical basis for Russian absolutism is a natural economy resting on the archaic communal property relations of the peasantry. This remains of this backward social struggle, and there are many such remains still to be found in Russia today, along with the total configuration of social factors constitute the basis for Russian Tsardom. The nobility is kept under the Tsar's thumb by an endless flow of handouts paid for by the taxing the peasantry. Foreign policy is conducted to the benefit of the bourgeois, with its opening of the new markets as its main objective, while customs policy put the Russian consumer at the mercy of the manufacturers. Finally, even the domestic activity of the Tsardom in the service of capital, the organization of industrial exploitations, the construction of the Siberian Railroad, and other projects of similar nature can be carried out with a view of advancing interests of capitalism. In general, under the Tsardom, the bourgeoisie plays an ignorant, important role in shaping the domestic and foreign policy, a role which numerical consequences would never permit them to play without the Tsar. This, then, is the combination of factors which gives the Tsardom its strength internally. So it continues to vegetate because the obsolete social forms have not yet completely disappeared, and the embryonic class rotations of modern society have not fully developed and crystallized. Again, the strength of the Tsardom abroad derives not from the partition of Poland, but the particular features of the Russian Empire. It is vast human masses who provide an unlimited source to military resources available in our command, which elevates Russia to the level of a first-rate European power. Its vastness and geographic position give Russia a very special interest in the European question, which it violates with the other socialist nations that are also involved with part of the world. At the same time, Russia borders on the British possessions in Asia, which is leading towards an inevitable configuration with England. In Europe, too, Russia is deeply involved with the most vital concerns of the European powers. Especially in the 19th century, the revolutionary class struggle just now emerging have put the Tsardom in the role of guardian of reaction in Europe, which fact also contributes to its state abroad. But above all, in speaking Russia's foreign policy position, especially over the last few decades, it is not the partition of Poland solely and exclusively, the annexation of Alsace-Lorraine, that lends its power by dividing Europe into two hostile camps, by creating a permanent threat of war and driving France further and further into the arms of Russia. From false pretenses come false conclusions, and the existence of an independent Poland could provide Russia of its powers home or abroad. The restoration of Poland could bring about the downfall of Russian absolutism only if it simultaneously abolishes the socialization for Tsardom itself, i.e., the remains of the old peasant economy and the importance of Tsardom both for the nobility and the bourgeois. Of course, this is arrant nonsense. It makes no difference. With or without Poland, these relations remain unchanged. The hope of breaking the hold of Russian omnipotence through the restoration of Poland is an anachronism stemming from the bygone time where it seems no hope that the forces with Russia would ever be capable of achieving the destruction of Tsardom. The Russia of that time, a land of natural economy, seemed, as it did to such countries, to be mired in total social stagnation. But since the 60s, it has set course towards the development of a modern economy, and in doing so has sown the seeds of the solution for the problem of Russian absolutism. The Tsardism finds itself forced to support a capitalist economy, but doing so saws off its limbs in which it sits. So, what is she saying here? Essentially, what she is arguing is one of the main premises and justifications for the support of the independence of Poland is that it will bring about the end of the Tsardom. And she argues that this is a fundamentally nonsensical concept, that the annexation of Poland makes very little difference to maintaining the Russian Tsardom, and that the Tsar cannot be overthrown simply from the liberation of Poland. Now, I think I would fully agree with this. I think tantamount to if Poland is necessary or not, if the liberation of Poland is necessary or not to the proletarian movement, you cannot argue something which is false in defending that position. There is, under these formulations of Russian Tsardom, you cannot argue that Poland's independence would have brought an end to Russian Tsardom, and as we actually saw, the end to Russian Tsardom came during the October Revolution, which was quickly followed up with a socialist revolution. The proletariat organized itself into a revolutionary camp, while the bourgeois was in the act of destroying the Tsardom and developed in itself, so the only path for the destruction of Tsardom in Russia was the social development, and no outside sources such as the partition of Poland that you could point towards it either maintaining its power or losing it. And thus we can conclude that in a system like Russia, which is a state without major interference from outside elements, it's an economy, it's not a colonized nation, that the path of its social change does not lie within the existence of other nations. Now, of course, you cannot, in this example, separate the Polish question from Russia, and Polish national identity and the Polish people deserve to have their own nation and their self-determination, but arguing that Poland's independence would bring about the end of Russian Tsardom is a totally just false argument. Now returning to the text. Though its financial policies in destroying whatever remains of the old agricultural communal relationships, thus eliminating any basis for conservative models of thought amongst the peasantry, what is more, its plundering of the peasantry, the Tsardom undermining its own material foundations and destroying the resources for which it purchased loyalty of the nobility. Finally, the Tsardom has made its special task to ruin the major class consumers at the bourgeois expense, thus leaving its pockets empty with the very class whose, particularly of interest, it sacrificed the interests of its own nation as a whole. Once a useful agent in the bourgeois economy, the ponderous bureaucracy has become its fetters, and the resultant accelerated growth of the industrial proletariat, the one social force within the Tsardom, cannot ally itself, and which it cannot give ground without jeopardizing its own existence. Thus, those are the social contradictions whose solution involves the downfall of opportunism, the Tsardom driving towards that fatal moment like a rolling stone on a steep hill. The hill is the development of capitalism, and as it foots the iron fists of the working class are raiding. Only a political struggle of the proletariat throughout the entire Russian Empire can accelerate this process. As she said, the October Revolution, which obviously hadn't happened by this point, but she, in this, protected what would be the fall of the Tsardom of Russia and the Socialist Revolution. This was a very prophetic explanation of what would happen in Russia and the Russian Revolution, and I think that brings a lot of, I guess, weight to this text. That not only that in this text talking about the liberation of Poland, she makes a totally correct prediction on how the development of social progresses would happen in Russia, which was the bourgeois coming to power and then immediately being opposed and then pretty quickly overthrown by the Russian proletariat. Now back to the text. Let us now take the first point of this resolution. The subjugation of one nature by another, we read, can serve only the interests of the capitalists and the despots while working for the Polish people and most oppressed and oppressor nation. It is equally pernicious. On the one basis, this proposition of the independence of Poland is supposed to become an imperative demand of the proletariat. Here we have one of those great truths, so great, in fact, that can be one of the greatest commonplaces, on which it can lead to no practical solutions whatsoever, if from assertion that the subjugation of one nation by another for the interest of capitalists and despots is therefore concluded that all annexations are unjust or can be eliminated within the capitalist system, then we hold this to be absurd, for it makes no allowance for the basic principles of the existing order. It is interesting to note that this point in the resolution is almost identical with the arguments of the notorious Dutch resolution. There's a footnote here. This is a reference to the Dutch draft resolution at the International Socialist Congress in Zurich 1893. It was rejected in favor of the German resolution on the same theme. Oh, dear Lord, more pronunciation. Protocol des Internationalen Sozialistischen Arbeiterkongressen in der Tohave Zurich vom 6 bis 12 August 1983, Zurich 1994, page 25. Since the subjugation and control of one nation by another can lie only in the interests of the ruling class, the proletariat is supposed to bring about the end of the war. With the aid of the striking military, both resolutions are based on the naive belief it is able to recognize any circumstances benefiting despots to the detriment of the working people, and in order to do away with immediately. The similarity goes further. The evil that must be rooted out in principle is the same in both resolutions. The Dutch resolution proposes to prevent future annexations by ending the war, while the Polish resolution intends to undo past wars by abolishing annexations. In both cases, the proletariat is supposed to eliminate war annexations under capitalism without eliminating capitalism itself, though both, in fact, are a part of the very essence of capitalism. Granted, the truism cites does not give any basis for the general abolition of annexations, it provides even less reason for abolishing the existing Polish annexation. In this case, without a critical assessment of the concrete history of condition, nothing of value can be contributed to the problem, but on this point, on the question of how and if the proletariat can liberate Poland, the resolution maintains a deep silence. The Dutch is more sophisticated in this respect, though it proposes a pacific means in which a secret accord with the military can allow us to see the utopian aspect of the resolution. The resolution is modest and contains a demand, although it is no less utopian than on the account of the other. How is the Polish proletariat to build a classless state? In the face of three governments ruling Poland, in the face of the bourgeois of the Polish Congress pandering to the throne in Petersburg, and recoiling from any thought of a restored Poland as a crime and a plot against its own pocketbook, in the face of the large Gagalian land holdings, in the person from the governing bandy. There's another footnote here. The reference is to a member of the Polish nobility in Austrian Poland who was prime minister from 1895 to 1897. I lost my place. Oh, there we go. Who watches over the unity of the Austrian monarchy? That is, guarantees its partition of Poland, and finally, in the face of the Polish junkers who provide the military budget and more supplies of bayonets to safeguard the Polish annexation in the face of all of those factors. What can the Polish proletariat do? Any rebellion would be bloodily suppressed, but if no rebellion is attempted, nothing can be done. Since armed rebellion is the only way that the Polish independence can be achieved, certainly none of these states can be accepted to voluntarily relinquish the provinces which they have ruled for 100 years under existing socialist conditions. Any rebellion of the proletariat would be crushed, and there could be no other result. Perhaps then the international workers would help. It, however, is in much less of a position to act than the Polish proletariat. At most, it can desire sympathy. But suppose the entire campaign of the support of the Polish restoration of Poland limits itself to peaceful demonstrations. Well then, in which case, of course, the partition state can continue to rule over Poland in all tranquility. So the international proletariat makes the restoration of Poland its political design. As the resolution requires, it will have done more than utter a pious wish. If one demands something, we must do something to achieve that demand. If one can do nothing, the empty demand waves will make the air tremble, but it certainly will not shake the ruling states over Poland. The adoption of a social patriotic resolution in the International Congress could have further reaching implications. Now, this is the point where I think I have a little bit of disagreement, but going over the previous thing, I actually do agree with her. It is impractical. It was impractical at the time to argue for the restoration of Poland as a major demand of the proletariat. And as we saw through history, Poland was only liberated until the Russian Revolution and the fall of Tsardom happened. And this is true. Her predictions and her analysis of the situation was, from my understanding of history, fully correct. Moving back to the text. First and foremost, it would go in the face of the decision of the previous Congress, especially those on the Dutch resolution about a military strike. In light of the essentially parallel arguments of identical context, the adoption of a socio-patriotic resolution would let the Dutch one in and again through the back door, while the Polish delegates who voted against the Nicene Revolution have now managed to propose what is essentially an identical resolution on the question we shall not discuss in the moment. In case it would be worse for the entire Congress to fall into a contradiction of such itself. Secondly, the resolution, if adopted, would have an import of the Polish movement and the delegate of the upcoming Congress have sure not to dare even imagine. For the past 3 years, I've discussed at length in my essay notes numbers 32 and 34, footnote, new tendencies in the Polish socialist movement in Germany and Austria. The attempt has been made to oppose Polish socialist program on the restoration of Poland, the intention to separate their German, Austrian, and Russian comrades, uniting them in a Polish party organized along nationalist lines. Given the utopianism of this program and the contradiction between it and any effective political struggle, the promoters of this tendency have not yet been able to provide this argument of the planned nationalist turn for such a strong withstand criticism, and though have been happy to circumvent about any disclosure of this tendency, while the Polish parties in Prussian and Austrian paper, the Bulletin Official, in countless articles, the Socialist Poland, the Poland of the Workers, Democratic Poland, and the Independent Republic of Poland, etc., these similar slogans have been praised in Polish, German, French by terms. The way is being prepared for a new adoption of a Polish class nationalist state into the program, and the crowning touch to this entire progress is to be the London Congress. Though the adoption of this revolution in the nationalist position is to be smuggled in under the international banner, the United Proletariat is presumably to drum up the red flag with its own hands on a nationalist edifice, and so concrete the temple of internationalism. Moreover, the sanction by the representatives of the international proletariat is meant to provide an effective cover for the social patriotism's total lack of scientific basis and raise to the level of dogma where it will be immune to criticism of any sort. Finally, this sanction is meant to encourage Polish parties to adopt once and for all the nationalist program to organize themselves along national lines. The adoption of the social patriotic revolution would establish an important resonance for the socialist movement in all of their countries. What good is to be purchased cheaply by the other? If national liberation of Poland is elevated to a goal of the international proletariat, why not also the liberation of Czechoslovakia, Ireland, Iceland, and all other objectives are equally utopian and no less justified than the liberation of Poland. The liberation of Alsace-Lorraine in particular would be far more important to the international proletariat and far more likely at that. Behind Alsace-Lorraine stands 4 million French bayonets, and the question of the bourgeois annexations bayonets carry more weight than moralistic demonstrations. If the Poles in 3 partitioned sectors organize themselves along national lines for the liberation of Poland, why should other nationalities in Austria not do the same? Why should not organize themselves with the French? In a word, the door would be open wide to national struggles and nationalist organizations. Rather than working in a class organized within political realities, there would be an espousal of organizational long lines, which often goes astray from the start. Instead of political programs, nationalist programs would be drawn up. Instead of a coherent political struggle, the proletariat in every country, through its disintegration through a series of fruitless national struggles, would be virtually assured. Here lies the great significance of the social patriotic resolution. If adopted, we stated at the beginning that it would be a great step forward the proletariat has made in the days of the international development from a small number of sectarian groups into a major party handling its own affairs. But what does the proletariat owe to this progress? Solely its ability to understand the primacy and of the political struggle and its activity. The old international gave way to parties organized in country in the conformity with political conditions under particular to that country. Without that account, organizing in regard of nationality of the workers, only political struggle in this line makes sense of the working class not strong and possible. But the social patriotic resolution performs a course in diametric opposition to this principle. Its adoption by the Workers' Congress would repudiate 32 years of the proletariat's accumulated experience in theoretical education. The social patriotic resolution was formulated quite cleverly. Behind the protest against the Tsardom lay the protest against annexation. After that, all demand for Polish independence is raised against Austria, Prussia, and as well against Russia. It sanctions nationalist tendencies with international tendencies. It tries to obtain the backing for practical program on the basis of a more moral demonstration, but weakens its argument even greater than the artfulness formulation of a few commonplace on the perniciousness of annexations and some nonsense about Polish's independence for Tsardom. This no more is what this resolution is capable of arguing. Now here's where me and Luxemburg come to disagree. She presents organizing along national lines and national repression to not be a fundamental need for a working class movement, but I fully disagree. Nationality is highly important to life, and I don't believe under a socialist state of affairs nationality would cease to exist, though under a world socialist republic, of course, something that is very far away from ever happening, it would be friendship between nations, but these nations would still exist, and independent socialist republics would exist in these nations for the self-determination of those nations. I do not believe that the question of patriotism and the self-determination of nations goes against the organization of the proletariat. I, of course, do not take the lines of the patriotic socialists, a very reactionary socialist ideology that they're almost chauvinist. I can't even particularly describe their understanding beyond they go among lines on which, instead of believing in a friendship among all nations, they believe that their nation is the best nation and want to oppose it upon other nations. Even if they say differently, this is the logical conclusion of their beliefs and how they oppose progress among national lines. But just opposing patriotic socialists and their reactionary tendencies does not mean that we cannot understand the importance of nationality in common life. Luxemburg, in my opinion, in her later writings, corrects this mistake, but it is a major mistake in the end. However, her writing is very good. It brings up many fascinating points, and in my opinion, excellently critiques the failures of, I guess, how the resolution presented itself. Now, moving on to social democracy and the national struggle in Turkey. This was published in the same year, in October, so a few months after the previous text, and covers the situation in Turkey. In this article, she will support the national liberation of Armenia in, being a socially progressive cause. Already, you see her understanding that there are cases in which national liberation is a important role for the proletariat. Later on, she would be much more defendant of national identity. Just 4 years later, she would write In Defense of Nationality, which defends national identity. her ideas on, just by doing these two readings, I wish to portray what I believe is a false narrative on Rosa Luxemburg's writing on the national question, where she just didn't believe nationality was important and argued against national liberation. This is not true, although she made many, in my opinion, incorrect arguments among the lines of national liberation. She was never, in a sense, against the liberation of people among national lines and understood the necessity of national identity. Her work on the section is very complex and evolves throughout her life and writings. We cannot take, just as we cannot take Rosa Luxemburg's opinion on Lenin and the Russian Revolution just from Marxism or Leninism, as she changed her mind and came to different conclusions later in life, we cannot take her opinion on the national question just from a handful of texts. She, throughout her life, developed ideas and changed her mind, just like anyone should do. And we need a complete view on her writings and her ideas. Now moving to the next text. The text begins, the Turkish situation. In the party press, we all too often encounter an attempt to represent the events in Turkey as a pure product of the play of diplomatic intrigue, especially on the Russian side. For a time, you could even come across voices in the press which argued that the Turkish outrages were mainly an invention, that the Bashi Bosuks were the two Christian paragons, and that the revolts of the Armenians were work of agents paid with Russian rubles. What is above striking about this position is that no way fundamentally different from the bourgeois standpoint. In both cases have the reduction of a great social phenomena to various agents. That is to deliberate the actions of diplomatic offices on the part of bourgeois politicians of such points of view are of course not surprising. The people that make history in the sphere and sense the thinnest thread of diplomatic intrigue has great importance for the position they take with regard to the short-term interests. But for social democracy, which at the present time merely elucidates them in the international sphere, which above all is concerned to trace back to the phenomena of public life, deeper lying material causes the same policy to be completely futile, on contradictory in foreign policies as in the domestic policies. Social democracy can adapt its own position, in which both spheres must be determined by the same standpoints, namely the international social conditions for the non in question, and in our principles. So how do these conditions with regard to the national struggle in Turkey, which concerns us here? Until recently, in part of the press, Turkey was still being portrayed as a paradise which different nationalities have coexisted peacefully for hundreds of years, possessed the most complete autonomy, and that only interference of European diplomacy had artificially created dissatisfaction by persuading the happy people of Turkey that they are oppressed, obstructing the innocent land of the Sultan from repeating his great reforms. First, there is a footnote here. At present, on the other hand, it is being said that the Sultan is to blame for everything, thus the victim becomes a scapegoat. From the following arguments, the readers will be convinced that this has nothing to do with the person, but the conditions. I have a further note. They only got angry because a bunch of outsiders convinced them that they were oppressed. The rhetoric never changes. It really never changes. Black people were happy in America until the evil liberals convinced them they were oppressed. Obviously, liberals used in the context of how it is spoken about by modern-day American conservatives, not actual liberalism. queer people were fine in society until X and X convinced them that they were oppressed and formed Pride. What's a Stonewall? So yeah, it really is, nothing ever changes, and these oppressed people aren't actually oppressed, and they're only fighting for their rights because some nebulous force has convinced them that they are oppressed. Back to the text, these assertions are based on an extensive ignorance of the conditions. Until the beginning, the present century Turkey was counter with a barter economy in which every nationality and every province and every community lived its own separate existence, patiently bore the suffering to which it was accustomed, and formed the true basis for Oriental despotism. These conditions, however oppressive as they might be, were nonetheless distinguished by great stability, and could therefore survive a long time without provoking rebellion. On the part of the subjugated people since the beginning of the present century, this has changed considerably, shaken by conflict with the strong centralized states in Europe, but especially threatened by Russia. The Turkey found itself compelled to introduce new domestic reforms, and thus necessary found its first representative in the person of Muhammad II, Ottoman Suleiman, from 1808 to 1839. The reforms abolished the feudal government and in its place introduced a centralized bureaucracy, a standing army, and a new financial system. The modern reforms, as always, involved enormous cost and translated in being the languages of the material interests of the population. They amounted to a colossal increase in public taxation, high indirect duties collected on every head of the cattle, and formerly and every piece of straw, the custom duties of stamp duties, and the taxes on spirits. The government title with then a periodical additional change every quarter, and then the direct income tax, which came to 30% in towns and 40% in the countryside, and with it the tax in lieu of military service for Christians, and finally more compulsory services. Henceforth, the people had to pay for the expenses of a reformed state. But it is this particular system of government which exists in Turkey that gives a true idea of the burdens that are borne. In a strange mixture of modern and medieval principles, it consists of a population, an immense number of administrative authorities, courts and assemblies which are bound up to capital in an extremely centralized manner in their conduct. But at the same time, all public positions are de facto venal and are not paid by the central government, but by mostly financed revenues of the local population, a kind of bureaucratic benefits. Thus, the Pasha can fleece the province to his heart's content so long as he sends a largest possible sum of money to Istanbul. Thus, the Qadi, or judge, is by virtue his own office of financial exactions, since he must himself pay an annual tribute to Constantinople for his local population, a kind of bureaucratic benefits. Thus, Pasha can fleece office. The most important, however, is the system of taxation, which, lying in the hands of the militarium, a tax former in comparison to the whole indent of general of the French Indonesian regime, looks like a good Samaritan and ends up with a total lack of system and rules and unlimited arbitrariness. And finally, in the hands of the bureaucracy, compulsory services were turned into a means of unbridled extortion and exploitation of the people. Obviously, a system of government constituted in this way is fundamentally different from the European model. While us in the central government fleeces the people and maintains its officialdom over the hand of the officialdom fleeces its people of its own part, thereby the finances of central government. Consequently, in Turkey, officialdom appears special, numerous classes of the population in which a person can be directly represented, an economic factor whose existence is financed by the professional pillage of the people. At the same time, the connection in the reforms that resulted a shift in the conditions of land ownership of the Christian peasants, again strongly to their disadvantage in the relation of the Turkish landowner. The latter, generally a former feudal lord, was able to make his hereditary quite on the Christian model, while the Spielstadt feudal tenure was abolished by the reform, and thus the tees hitherto paid by them by the Beyaz were redirected to the executioner. He sought to assert himself in the character of an owner of land, and as a result, the new tax of the peasants, ground rent, grew up, and alongside the old tithes, a tax which regularly amounted to the third of the net process. After the deduction of the tithe, for the Christian peasant there often remained no salvation, and amid these wondrous things, often to transfer a small piece of land, obutan, as a conditional gift to the Muslim church, and then receive it back as a leasehold on which rent was due, but the least free of the tithes. By the end of 1870, the Mornatan property of the Turkish amounted to more than half of cultivatable land property. Thus, reforms were accompanied by a terrible deteriorism in the material conditions of the people, but what made them particularly unbearable was the quite modern feature which had become involved in this situation, namely the insecurity, the regular tax system, and the fluctuating relationships of land ownership above all money economically as a result of the transformation in tax money and the development of foreign trade. The old conditions have deteriorated and their stability gone forever. Part 2, the disintegration. In the moment of Turkey's history, our previous article is in certain respects reminiscent of Russia. But while there are reforms after the Crimean War, created once at the same time by rapid development of capitalism and the material foundations for the administrative and financial innovations for the further development of militarism, in Turkey the economic transportation corresponding to the modern reforms was completely lacking. All attempts of native industry in Turkey miscarried. The few factories founded by the government produced goods were of poor quality and expensive. The absence of the most elementary preconditions of the bourgeois order, the security of persons and property, at least formal equality under the law, and a civil law separates it from religious law, the modern means of communication, etc., make the appearance of capitalist forms in production, and the absolute impossibility. The trading policy of the European states towards Turkey operates in the same direction, exploiting its political importance to ensure the unprotected market for its own industries. Until now, alongside usury, has been the only manifestation of domestic capital. Economically, therefore, Turkey remained with the most primitive peasant agriculture, in which the cases of property relevations had not gotten rid of their semi-feudal character. It is clear that a material basis for the money economy constructed like this had not grown in parallel with forms of government and financial taxes associated with it. It was flattened by it and could not develop. It was moving to a process of disintegration, the disintegration of Turkey being glanced over in two extremes at the same time. In one hand, it was a permanent deficit arose in the peasant economy. This acquainted and tangible expression of the usurper had become an organic element of the village community and indicated the internal festering of conditions like abscesses. The third cent monthly interest rates were a permanent phenomenon in the Turkish villages, and the regular epilogue to the silent drama of the villages, the proletarianization of the peasant without forms in production being available in the country, which would have enabled him to be absorbed in the modern working class. With the result of that, he is often sunk down into the lumpen proletariat. These phenomena are further linked to the decline of agriculture, devastating famines, and foot and mouth disease. On the other hand, there was a deficit in the state treasury since 1854. Turkey had taken the road of endless foreign loans. The usurers in London and Paris operated capital just as the Armenian Greek usurers operated the villages. Ruling became ever more difficult. Those ruled became ever more dissatisfied. Bankruptcy in the capital and bankruptcy in the villages. Palace revolutions in Constantinople and popular risings in the provinces. These were the ultimate results of the internal decline. It was impossible to find a way out of this situation. The remedy could only have been achieved through a total transformation of the economic and social life through the transition of a capitalist form of production. But there did not exist either the basis for such transformation or the social classes that would come forward to a representative. The repeatedly granted reforms of the Sultan could obviously not alleviate the difficulties, since they were necessary no more than the further judicial innovations which left social and economic life undisturbed and often simply remained on paper since they were opposed to the dominant interest of officialdom. Turkey cannot regenerate itself as a whole, thus the outlet of different lands, stability of way of life, provinces, and nationalities has disappeared. But no material interest, no common development had ever been created which could give them internal unity. On the contrary, the pressure and misery belonging to the Turkish state became even greater, and thus there was a natural tendency for the various nationalities to escape the whole and distinctively seek higher social development of autonomous existence. Thus, the historical sentence was pronounced in Turkey, it was facing ruin. Even if all the subjugation of the Ottoman government came to the expense of the misery of the decaying state organism and the various Muslim people, Druzes, Naziks, Kurds, and Arabs also rebelled against the Turkish yoke. The separatist tendency, above all, spread to the Christian land. Here, the conflict of material conditions also coincided with the national frontier. The Christian is denied his right, his oath values against a Muslim. He cannot bear arms, he cannot rule, he cannot hold any public office. But what is more important, the peasantry often occupies the land of the Muslim landowner and is sucked dry by the Muslim officials. At a grassroots level, therefore, there is a frequency class struggle. The struggle of the small peasants and the tenants with the class of landowners and officials. Example in Bosnian Herzegovina, where the condition is strongly reminiscent of Ireland. Thus, the opposition produced by an economical and legal pressure here, ready-made ideology and the natural and religious conflicts, the mixture of religious elements was bound to give them a particularly crude and savage character. Thus all the elements were presented to create a struggle to the death of the Christian nation with Turkey and the struggle of the Greeks, the Bosnian, Herzegovinian, Serbs and Bulgarians, and now the sequence has reached the Armenians. In the face of social conditions which have briefly sketched out here, the claims rising of the national struggles in Turkey have been artificially produced by agents of the Russian government seems no more serious than the claims of the bourgeois that the whole modern labor movement is the work of a few social democratic agitators. Note, social democratic was one thing which obviously split into the modern day of communists and social democrats, where social democrats are very reactionary and basically liberals. So I think when reading early writings of like Lenin and Luxemburg and all these people, you can generally just replace the word social democrats with communists. Admittedly, the dissolution of Turkey is not advancing purely in its old admittance. Initially, the tender hands of the Russian Cossacks rendered the midwife services of the births of Greek, Serbia, and Bulgaria. The Russian ruble is the permanent stage matter of the historic drama of the Black Sea, but here diplomacy is doing no more than throwing a burning stick and inflammable material which the mountains have been accumulated during the centuries of injustice and exploitation. What we have to deal here is a process of developing inexorably a law of nature, the impossibility of the continuation of archaic economic forms in Turkey, and the face of the official system in the money economy, and the impossibility of the money economy in developing into capitalism. That is key to understanding the Balkan Peninsula and the basis of the existence of Turkish despotism being undermined. But the basis for its development into a modern state is not being created, so it must perish, not as a form of government, but as a state, not through the class struggle, but through the struggle of nationalities. What is being created here is not regenerated Turkey, but a series of new states carved out in the carcass of Turkey. Now, this is a situation we have to discuss the position of social democracy to take in the elevation of Turkish events. Part 3, the point of view of social democracy. Now, what can be the position of social democracy towards the event of Turkey? In principle, social democracy always sides on the stance of aspiration of freedom. The Christian nations, in this case the Armenians, want to liberate themselves from the yoke of Turkish rule, and social democracy must declare itself unresortively in support of their cause. Immediately here, just a few months later, after writing that supporting the Polish cause is not an goal of the proletarian movement, she then says, from a moralistic standpoint, the liberation of Armenians must be a goal, immediately showing her development on this question. Of course, in foreign politics, just as a domestic question, we should not see things schematically. The national struggle is not always appropriate a forum for a struggle of freedom. For example, the national question takes a very different form in Poland, Alesi Loam or Bohemian. In these cases, we are faced with the directly opposing forces of capitalist assimilation of the annexed lands to the dominant ones, which condemns the separatist efforts to impose its interests on the working class movement to advocate the unity of forces. This fragmentation in national struggles, but not only of the results in Turkey, the situation is different. The Christian lands are bound by Turkey not only by force, they have no working class movement and are declining in virtue of the natural social development or rather dissolution, and hence the aspirations of freedom can make themselves felt only in the national struggle. Therefore, a partnership must admit any doubt it is drawn to political demands for the Armenians, or just to determine the political form in which we should aspire hereto. The Armenians' own aspirations must be taken into consideration as well as its internal conditions and international context. For the question, what above the general standpoint of this requires for the insurgents and not against them? She still holds the position and the criticism of the national question in Poland, which I praised in the last article, but the mistake that I criticized near the end has already seen development. What is the practical interest of social democracy? Do we not fall into a contradiction by taking the aforementioned principled stance? We think we can prove the exact opposite in these 3 points. Firstly, the liberation of Christian lands from Turkey means progress in international political life. The existence of an artificial position that of today's Turkey, where so many interests of the capitalist world converge, but has retarding effects on the political development. The Eastern question, together with its Algerian forces, the European powers, to pursue the policy of stratagems, deceptions to conceal the real interests under the deceptive names, and to seek the subterfuges. With the liberation of Christian nations from Turkey, bourgeois politics will be stripped from its last idealistic tatters, and the protection of Christians will be reduced to its true content, naked in the interest of plunder. This is just as beneficial to its cause in the reduction of all sorts of liberal and enlightened programs, in quotation marks. The programs of the bourgeois parties being purely and simply questions of money. Secondly, it follows that the earlier articles, the separation of lands from the Christian lands from Turkey is a progressive phenomenon and an act of social development. For the separation is not only the way in which Turkish lands can achieve higher forms of social life. As long as land remains under Turkish rule, there can be no question for the modern capitalist development. Secondly, Turkey acquires European form state and bourgeois institutions, and it is gradually formed into a general stream on capitalist development. Thus, Greece and Romania have made a striking progress since their speculation of Turkey. It is now true that the newly emerging states are minor states, but nevertheless it would be wrong to perceive their establishment as a process of political fragmentation, for the Turkey itself is not only a great power in the modern sense of the term, but countries with bourgeois development in the ground are also being gradually prepared for the modern working class movement, for social democracy. For example, the case is already the case in Romania, and to some extent in Bulgaria. There's a footnote here. The Armenian socialists are therefore, in our opinion, wrong when they, in Die Nunziat, volume 14 and number 42, where they think they have to justify their separatist aspiration with ostensible capitalist development in Armenia. On the contrary, the separation from Turkey is not only the precondition for the germination of capitalism, and of course capitalism is a precondition for a socialist movement. In our opinion, therefore, the Armenian comrades must, to paraphrase Lassalle, for the time being conserve themselves with the preconditions for the precondition of socialism, the kind of precondition squared. Luxemburg's note. Where's my place? I've got to keep losing my place when I'm reading footnotes. There we go. Thereby our highest interest is satisfied, namely that as far as possible the socialist movement should get a foothold in all countries. Thirdly, and lastly, the dissolution of Turkey is closely linked with the question of Russian rule in Europe. This lands the heart of the matter. When our press at the time took the side of Turkey, this clearly did not happen out of innate cruelty, but as some sort of preference for the partisans of polygamy. Obviously, the basis was an essential opposition to the appetites of Russian absolutism, which seeks road to world domination of the corpse of Turkey and wants to use the Christian nations for its advance on Constantinople. But our opinion, the goodwill was applied in the wrong way, and our measures against Russia sought against the opposite directions from when they really lie. Previous experience has already shown that policy towards the Balkan Peninsula, Russia usually achieved the exact opposite of what it was striving for. The people from Turkish rule have regularly replayed Russia's benevolence with brace integrated, and that they have bluntly rejected in exchange for Russian yoke for the Turkish. However, unexpected was for the Russian diplomats, the conduct of the Balkan states was very far from surprising. Between them and Russia, there was a national conflict of interest. The same conflict exists between the lamb and the wolf, the hunter, the prey. Dependence on Turkey is a veil which conceals this conflict of interest, even allows for it to appear superficially and temporarily as a community interest. The masses do not engage in complex, remote reflections, since national risings in Turkey are certainly mass movements, and the best method of correspondence and their immediate interest in even this vile method of diplomacy in Russia. But as soon as the trains between the Christian lands and Turkeys have been broken, the Russian diplomacy shows its fear place as true villainous, and the liberated man must immediately, instinctively turn against Russia. If nations subjugated by Turkey and our Russian allies, the nations liberated from Turkey, become so natural enemies of Russia, Bulgaria's present-day foreign policy towards Russia is a great result of its semi-freedom, a resulting change which still links it to Turkey. Even more importantly is another result produced in this progress. The result of the liberation of Christian lands from Turkey is taken seriously as the liberation of Turkey from its Christian subjects. It is precisely these which serve a motive of European diplomacy to operate in Turkey who could sign it unconditionally from the Russian side. Moreover, the event of war to make Turkey unable to resist. The Christians do not serve in the Turkish armed forces, but are ready to rise against them. Therefore, foreign war for Turkey has always meant a second war at home, and therefore disperses of its military forces and paralysis of its movement. Freed from the Christian torment, Turkey would undoubtedly adopt a freer position in international politics, and its state territory would be more commensable from Turkish forces. Above all, it would rid itself with the enemy within, and the natural ally of every eternal aggressor. In short, the reunification of rule over the Christian makes the Ottoman government more capable of resilience, above all in relation to Russia. This explains why Russia today is in favor of the integrity of Turkey. It is now in its interest for Turkey to remain in possession of the Balkulias, which will cause its disorganization. The Christian nations, for these, therefore remain under the yoke of Turkey and dependent on Russia until favorable moment arise for it to carry out its plan in regard to Constantinople. This also explains why we must be in favor of the liberation of Christians. In our opinion, it seeks to remedy against the advance of Russian reaction aforementioned results of the Turkish disintegration, and not an observation whether Salisbury, the man for the job, or not, is to show the Russians the back of Turkey. And thus this aggregate for the integrity of Turkey actually means playing into the hands of Russian diplomacy. To imagine a distant political conductors in its detail is fantasy, but far from impossible that the resistance of a liberated Turkey and the resistance of Balkan lands could frustrate Russia into an advance so long that Russian absolutism would not live to see the final solution of Constantinople and would have to die to the benefit of the people without being able to participate in the settlement of the question of the universal concern. Thus, our practical interests completely coincide with the principal standpoint. Hence, we recommend the following propositions be adopted for our present state in social democracy and the Eastern question. We must process the distinction of Turkey with the preeminent fact that not get in our heads and it could or should be stopped. We should give our fullest sympathy for the aspiration of Christian nations for autonomy. We should welcome these aspirations above all as means of fighting against Tsarist Russia and emphatically advocate their independence from Russia as well from Turkey. It is no accident that the questions dealt here with practical considerations have the same conclusions of our general principle for the aims and principles of social democracy derived from real social development and based upon it from the historical process must at extent agree that amidst our bringing this of the social democratic mill that we can look our immediate interest in the best way of maintaining principle and a deeper look therefore make it superfluous for us to make diplomats in the cause of a greater movement to seek combating these diplomats and other diplomats. This is just coffee house politics. I hope you enjoyed these readings of the Polish question at the Second International Congress in London and social democracy in the national question in Europe. Make sure to subscribe, like, comment, and all those YouTube things get me pushed in the algorithm. Tell me what you think of the text. Do you agree with my comments? Do you disagree with my comments? Do you agree with Comrade Luxemburg's work? Do you disagree with her work? Discussion over these texts, especially what in my opinion is one of the more misunderstood and more brilliant theorists of the early 20th century, is always welcome and always important for the better theoretical understanding of all socialists and communists in their struggle to create a better world. Goodbye and have a good day.